Good morning, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with you all. As I said earlier, my name is Greta Long, and I am the Director of Youth Ministries here at Pekin Grace. If this is your first time joining us this week, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad that you chose to worship with us this morning. And for those of you joining us again this week on this journey of reading through the Bible in a year, thank you for being here. Thank you for keeping up with your reading. And thank you for suffering through Job with me. Haha, get it? Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that got a laugh. Didn't know if it would. So this week we are talking about Job. And so before I jump into all of the good stuff that comes out of that book, I want to give you some context about who wrote it, when it was written, all that jazz. And so Job is the oldest book of the Bible, the oldest scroll that we have access to. And because of that, that means we don't know who wrote it, nor do we know who it was intended for. And when people learn that, they're often like, okay, so why is it in the Bible? Why does it matter? Why is it relevant? But it's relevant because this book tackles a lot of the questions that we still wrestle with today. Questions like, why do we suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? And where does God fit into all of that? So the main theme of this book is suffering in the lives of the righteous. And our key verse that our lovely liturgist read for us is, "My eyes had heard about you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I relent and find comfort on dust and ashes." This comes from the end of the book of Job, after Job has experienced all of the trauma and just bad stuff in his life, and he kind of has a certain level of clarity and peace with what happened, and he's able to kind of reflect on what happens in his life. So the book of Job, jam-packed full of awesome stuff and really good life lessons, but this book also follows a general pattern to how we read it. And so the beginning of the book is very narrative, very third-person view. If you are literally looking at the text in the Bible, it's regular paragraphs. And then we move into dialogue, where it's more spaced out, looks more lyrical, like a poem almost. And then we shift back into a narrative sense. And so the book opens with a scene, and we as an audience are invited in to the holy court of angels. And God is present, and we get introduced to this character called Hasatan, which is the original language pronunciation of it, but we socially now know that character as Satan. And so Hasatan enters the court of angels, and God notices him and says, "Hey, where have you been? What have you been up to? What have you been doing all this time?" And Hasatan responds, "I've just been walking around up and down on the earth, simply existing." And God says, "Have you noticed my servant Job?" Because in Job's time, Job was all-star, had it made, best land, best livestock, was the most devout Christian at the time. He had never questioned God, never doubted God. He just seemed to be set. And so God, bragging a little bit about his servant, says, "Have you noticed Job? Because I have, and he seems like he's doing pretty well." And Hasatan says, "Yeah, I can't believe he's never questioned you. I think I can change that if you let me." And so God says, "Sure, have at Job, just don't touch him." And because of this, Job loses his entire family. He loses his children, he loses his land, he loses his livestock. His life is just washed away. And so after this, Job is distraught. He is very upset. He is broken. And so in Job's time, in biblical times, when someone was mourning or grieving, they would tear their cloak and cover themselves in dust and ashes to signify to their peers that they were in a time of mourning and grief. And Job did all of this, but throughout all of that, he never once cursed God. He never once blamed God. He never once questioned his faith. And so Hasatan goes back up to the court of angels, and once again, God is like, "Where have you been? What have you been doing?" And Hasatan says, "I've been walking up and down and around the earth, just existing." And it's here that I noticed that he didn't say, "Oh, I went and ruined Job's life." It wasn't a direct attack. It feels like it, but Hasatan, the presence of bad, was simply just existing. And Job, Hasatan says, "I've just been existing," and God once again says, "Okay, have you noticed my servant Job? You can mess with him some more, just don't kill him. And this time, Job is covered in sores, and he is just transformed into this figure that people do not want to be around. They don't want to come near him, they don't want to interact with him for fear of catching whatever Job got. And so not only has Job lost his livelihood and his stature and his importance in the community, he has now lost his entire social circle. And so, once again, Job is grieving, and he's exhausted, and he's tired, and he's broken. And it's at this point where Job's wife comes to him and says, "Haven't you lost enough already? Wouldn't it be enough to just curse God and die so you don't have to deal with this anymore?" And Job says no. Job says, if God gives me the good stuff in my life, then I must also endure the bad. And so that kind of finishes the first narrative part of this book. And the beginning of that just gives us the insight on how Job responds to trauma and how Job responds to all of the hardship in his life. And it serves as a guide for how we can respond to trauma in our lives. And that's what makes it one of the most relatable books to us today. We then move into a narrative portion where the patterns begin to emerge, and something happens to Job, and then Job complains about it, and then one of Job's friends comes and talks to him about it and tries to offer counsel, and then Job talks to God about it, and then the cycle kind of repeats of complaining, and then counsel, and then God intervening. And so in this section of the book, we get introduced to Job's friends, and there's 3 of them. And once they hear about what Job has endured, as really good friends should, they come to him. They travel to where he is. They, in solidarity, tear their cloaks and cover themselves in ash and dust, and they sit with Job. And they sit in complete silence with Job for 7 days, a whole week, just sitting in silence and solidarity. And that was really good of his friends. That is exactly what his friends should do in that time. Our troubles begin when his friends decide to open their mouths. Job's friends, when looking at him and all of the trauma he has experienced, assume that Job must have done something terrible and that God is now punishing him. And Job's like, I didn't do anything. I was doing really well, actually. So why is this happening to me? Throughout this book, it's easy to look at the character of God and critique and condemn. But I feel like this book aims less to highlight the character of God and aims more to highlight the character of humanity and what our role is. So on that note, I have some good news and I have some bad news. I'm going to start with the bad news first. Bad news is we will encounter trauma and suffering and pain on this earth. It's inevitable. Our suffering will likely look different than Job's, though. It could be grief, depression or anxiety, loss, a global pandemic, the effects of systemic racism, or any other situation that leads us to feel disconnected from God and God's love. But good news is that part of what makes humanity intrinsically good is our ability to empathize and to understand each other's suffering and pain, because we've likely felt something similar. And we see that through Job's friends and their initial response. The other good news is that the worst things in our life, it's never the last thing. Adversity, trauma, and any other kind of bad stuff does not invalidate our faith. It does not invalidate the love that God has for us. Job saw this and Job understood this. It's the understanding of this concept that makes Job's faith essential to this book. This understanding and this kind of clarity and wisdom that comes with the experience of trauma and Job's level of relationship with God is powerful. And I feel like we've all experienced the same clarity when we've lost something or feel like we have lost everything and we're forced to rely on God alone. Earlier I mentioned Job's wife and how she responded to the trauma she witnessed Job experiencing. And we can see here that she didn't have the same understanding and clarity of who God is and where God is in the midst of trial. So this kind of pits the two of them together. Similarly, Job's friends didn't have the same clarity. They thought they did. They thought they understood why this was happening, but they were incorrect. This book and the issues within it show up all over society today, secularly and religiously, both in entertainment and literature. For example, the show WandaVision, that Eric's talked about a few times, struggles and deals with the issue of grief for the entire duration of the show. In the show, the character Wanda loses the love of her life and all of her friends. And then, through her response, she creates a whole new reality to help her cope. In this point, she does not have clarity. She is running full on emotions and no logic at all. And later in the show, we see her partner, Vision, kind of begin to understand what drove her to this and what she's feeling. Vision, as a third party, has clarity, and he is able to look at Wanda and kind of bring some sense and some stability back into her life. Similarly, grief, trauma, and adversity can be related to a lot of things to help us understand and cope with it more. Many people describe times of hardship as like a winter season in their life, where there is no growth, there is no life, there is only cold, dark, damp, and you feel extremely isolated. Author Parker Palmer in Let Your Life Speak talks about this, where he says, "Dormancy and deep sleep and rest are essential to all living things. The season of winter is a time where we are inclined to follow nature's cue and retreat underground to renew ourselves and prepare ourselves for spring." This hibernation sense is precisely what Job did when sitting in the ash and the dust and reflecting and thinking and just kind of stopping his world for a second. We are similarly in this midst of the hibernation. We are in the season of Lent, and it's the invitation to retreat, to re-examine and reprioritize our lives in preparation for new life. We are just like Job. We are sitting in the ash preparing for what comes next. We can see the proverbial finish line both in a liturgical sense as we approach Lent and Easter, and in a social sense as we begin to see things opening up and vaccines rolling out and the opportunity to be with our loved ones once again. The power in this book is Job's ability to not ask why, but to ask what next. What happens now? What do you need me to do next? And originally, Job didn't have a happy ending to look forward to. At the very end of the dialogue section of this book, before we transfer back into a narrative sense, God and Job have an encounter, which we call the whirlwind, like a literal whirlwind, to signify God's power and awesomeness. And in this whirlwind experience for Job, God asks him, "Who are you to question me? Were you there when I created everything? Who do you think you are?" And this kind of flips a switch for Job. He's like, "Oh, yeah, I am a mere human, and you are God. I need not question you. I spoke about things that I did not have knowledge of, and for that I apologize." And originally, that's where the book ends. Job goes home with himself and what he has left, and he is invited and forced to live the rest of his life knowing what he knows. The added ending that we read in most translations today ends with Job receiving everything back in full. It ends with Job having an additional conversation with God, and God saying to Job's friends, "Hey, I'm not pleased with you. You did not handle that situation well." And then God rewards Job for his dedication and his loyalty to him. And Job gets everything back in full and then some. Twice the land, twice the livestock, twice the children, twice the everything. So Job had a good ending and a happy ending in the translations we read now. And we also have a happy ending. And this happy ending may not come immediately. It might not come for you on Easter morning. But whatever point you're at in your hibernation, however long you've been sitting in the ash and the dust, and however long you need to continue doing that, there is a finish line. There is a happy ending. There is new life coming. Most people see Job and they grimace. They run away from the book because they know it tackles a bunch of hard questions and it brings up and stirs up feelings for them that they don't want to deal with. Talking about trauma is not easy and it's not fun. When I look at the book of Job, I see hope for humanity and for our ability to empathize and to help each other through our times of trial. And I feel comfort in the fact that God is steadfast and present with us when we feel like Job. Throughout the book, aside from the very beginning, God appears. We hear about God from Job's perspective, but that's about it. And so it's easy to ask, where did God go? Why did God abandon Job? But at the beginning, God says, "Have you noticed my servant Job?" This implies that God had previously and is continuously watching over Job, looking after him, monitoring him to some degree. This shows us that throughout the times of trial, God did not disappear. God was watching, God was responding, God was waiting for our response, and the same goes for us. Trauma, adversity, trial, that does not nullify our faith, it does not invalidate our faith. Instead, it's an opportunity for us to grow in it and to create a stronger relationship with God in our reliance upon him. So as we go forth this week, I pray and I hope that you all, in whatever adversity you may be experiencing, you can find new ways to interact with God and to just notice how God is working in your life throughout times of adversity and trial. So now, if you would join me in a prayer, we will be good. Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for your presence in our lives, even at times when it is hard for us to see it. I pray that for us, those of us who are experiencing adversity, trauma, and other hardships in our lives, that we may continually focus on you and do our best to find ways to notice you and how you're working in our lives. I pray that you equip ourselves, and those around us, our friends and family, with the necessary tools that we need to empathize and to provide care to each other throughout times of hardship. I pray that we may be like Job and we may find times to relent and respond and reflect on what we're experiencing, and that we may then go forth and interact with you and understand how our relationship with you works. I thank you for the time that we've been given today, and I pray that we may go out and bless you throughout the week this week. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Greta.